Hello and welcome to the Particular Baptist podcast. Today we are, first of all, Sean and I are back after kind of a long hiatus. We were traveling and there was some sickness, and it just worked out that we took a long break. So after 3 weeks, we're back. So thank you for your patience. But we're picking back up in our series on through Dennis Prager's short series on the Ten Commandments, or the 10 sayings, as we'll talk about today, as he talks about. But we're on the beginning, or kind of the preface of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God. He has a specific video that he talks about with this, and we'll go ahead and dive right into that. Sean, is there any introductory comments you want to bring forth before we dive into the video?
Not really. I guess I'll just say that as Dan alluded to, he's dealing with what we would call the introduction to the Ten Commandments, but he actually calls the first commandment. And we'll get into why we don't think that it's appropriate to label this as the first commandment. But just as a note, so people don't get confused right from the start.
Yep. Yeah, he's going to come at this from a kind of wonky perspective, but we'll dive right in. Like last time, we'll play the entire video. We'll comment as we go through. Have any questions, comments, pop them in to the, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, they'll show up on our end so we can see them and join the discussion. So we'll go ahead and dive right into Prager's video.
What is the first of the 10 Commandments? Might seem like an odd question, but it's not. Jews and Christians give different answers. The reason is that what we know as the 10 Commandments is, in the original Hebrew, the 10 statements. And since the Hebrew is the original, we begin with the first statement, which all religions agree is, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage.
Do you want to say anything, Sean?
Yeah, I guess I can jump in right here. So Dennis Prager translates the Hebrew word that's used in reference to the Ten Commandments as statements. The Hebrew word devar as statements, and that is a legitimate translation. But he makes the point, I guess, that it's the 10 statements. Therefore, the very first thing should be a statement, and that is, I am the Lord your God. However, the word devar actually can have the connotation of a commandment, and just two spots where the word is used. Daniel 9:25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem under the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troubled times. So you'll note there that the word has been translated commandment, and it fits well with the context, because there was a command by the king of Persia to have, or there will be a command, I should say, for the Jerusalem to be rebuilt. It's a command, so it's perfectly acceptable in that context to translate the word as command. And then I also had Genesis 44:2. And this is about Joseph, and what Joseph said, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the sack's mouth of the youngest, and his corn money, and this is the servant. And he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. So Joseph speaks to his servant to do this, and the servant does this. So you'll note in this context, the word, it's here translated as word, but it really is a commandment. So the word, just like a lot of words, can have different nuances in how you use it and mean slightly different things. So I don't think it's inappropriate to translate it as commandment. And I actually think it's a little interesting that he has a little slight dig on commandments not being the original, but the original Hebrew is statement, when actually that's not even technically true. I looked it up in two different lexical sources. The first is Brown Drivers Briggs, which is a fairly well-known Hebrew lexicon, and they just said its primary definitions are speech or word. And I looked it up in Strong's, and it said the same thing. So it's not even that it's statement; it's more akin to word or speech or saying, or something like that. Statement obviously is related to those and is probably a valid translation in certain contexts, but that's not the literal definition there. So it's a little interesting that, like, oh, we can't, like, the word commandment, that's not correct, but I can use statement, which isn't necessarily the literal translation. It's a valid translation, but it's not the literal translation. So just a little bit of background there. This allows him, this framework allows him to say that, oh, this is the first commandment, I am the Lord, or the first statement, I am the Lord your God. And we'll get into more, I think, why that's probably that is inappropriate as we go on. But just wanted to note that.
No, that's a good point. It's like he's not telling the entire story of the etymology behind it. And yeah, it's only a 5-minute video or whatever. It's about 5 minutes. But if you're going to make an assertion like that, you need to be able to back it up, because there will be people who, like us, who can come and say, well, you know, it says this over here, this over here. And it also changes, like you said, it's going to set him up for how he presents the rest of his arguments, right? It really sets it up. I think it's going to set the stage for the rest of the series, but it really does set up how he's going to discuss the rest of this video.
Yep.
This statement is so important that none of the other commandments make sense without it. First, it asserts that God...
Yeah.
You'll note he then immediately went to use the word commandment. None of the other commandments work without it.
He's interchanging the terminology.
Yeah, so even he's using the terminology, but it's funny because I am the Lord your God is not a commandment. It is just a statement. And maybe I'll get into a little bit of the argument here. In order for, well, there are 10 commandments, right? We'll go through them and show that there are 10 unique commandments. So if you're trying to translate it as oh, well, there are 10 statements, you would really have 11. Now he's, and we'll get more into the reason why next episode, that this is inappropriate, but he actually combines the first and second commandment into one commandment. And that's how he's able to maintain the order of 10. And then next episode, we can go into more specifics about why they really are two separate commandments. But yeah, he's in order to maintain his list and keep this as the first commandment, what we would just say is an introductory statement to the coming 10 commandments. He's got to combine two.
Yep. Yeah, he's really trying to make it work on both sides. And then I guess try to use the terminology interchangeably to try and make his system work. But it really makes it more confusing, I think, than anything else.
Yeah, if I were going to say, oh, it shouldn't be translated commandment, it should be translated statement, I just use the word statement the entire time. I wouldn't refer to it as the other commandments when the one I'm referring to is not a commandment. It's just
exactly
very confusing.
Yeah, because you can see very clearly, you know, once you get past the quote statement, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, there are imperatives. You know,
yes,
don't have any other gods before me. Don't make idols. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. And you can't really say that they are strict statements at that point. Or merely statements, I should say. I guess they can be statements in their own right, but they can't be merely statements like he's presenting them.
Exactly.
So he's getting himself digging a hole for himself that he's not going to be able to get out of.
God is giving these commandments, not Moses and not any other human being. Second, God is the one who delivered you from slavery. Again, no human being did this, not even Moses. Therefore, you have an obligation to me, God. And what is that obligation? That you live by the following 9 commandments. This is the beginning of what is known as ethical monotheism, the greatest world-changing innovation of the Hebrew Bible. It means 2 things.
Do you want to pause there? So I would want to ask him a little bit more what he means with that language of the world-changing innovation of ethical monotheism. Because to me, innovation sounds like this is something new. Whereas to be Jewish, as Dennis Prager is, or to be Christian, is to have a recognition that this isn't actually an innovation at all, because God has been around since the beginning. It's not even the first time he's given a law. He gave a law to Adam in the garden. So it's weird language to say this is a world-changing innovation. I mean, I guess you could argue that since the dispersion of the nations at Babel, most people weren't aware that God had ever given a law. But I don't know. It's just weird language, and I don't like it. It feels very much like a lot of the ways that theological liberals will speak about things in the Bible, like, oh, this was an innovation. It had never been thought of before, when really it's like, no, it's just historical. This is an event that happened, but God existed prior to this.
Yeah, and I would have to assume that the law of God had no role in human society prior to the law being given to the Israelites in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 18 or whatever the other passages are.
And
so
actually, we have examples. I want to say Cain and Abel are giving sacrifices, right? We're not told when they're given the law regarding the sacrifice, but they're doing it. So it'd be a little silly to say that, oh, well, the rest of the law, the moral law, was never in any way given. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think this ties directly to what we'll see later, is that Prager sees the 10 Commandments or the 10 Statements or whatever he wants to call it as really a societal framework and nothing more than that.
Yeah.
There's no spiritual significance to this besides maybe that they came from God and it's how God has called us to live, but it really just has to do with how you're supposed to treat your neighbor and how society is to be framed. There's no spiritual significance other than that, if that's even considered spiritual significance from his point of view. So I think that this is tying into that. Oh, look, it's like this big societal change that came on the scene, and then, oh, look what it did to the Israelites, and then it became the framework for the United States government. I think that's probably the trajectory he's going.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey, what did I see that Christy Aramu said something? What'd she say? Hey guys, I've seen the videos in the past, but don't know much about him. Does he profess to be a Christian? Oh, no. Christy, thanks for the question. It's a good question. So Dennis Prager is a professing Jew. So he's coming at this, and there might be different strains of Judaism, but he's coming at this from a Jewish perspective. It's certainly not a Christian perspective.
Yeah. No,
So
he's despite being politically conservative, he's actually a little bit more on the theologically liberal side of Judaism. He would not be considered conservative. I know, for one example, he holds that there's no issue with gay marriage, which obviously would not be a conservative position within Judaism. So yeah, he's not even necessarily representative of conservative Judaism.
So he's kind of his own branch a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I can't claim to be an expert on exactly
Right.
what his religious beliefs are. That's basically the extent to what I know. But yeah.
Good question. All right, we press on here.
Means that the one God, that's monotheism, is the source of ethics, of morality. Morality, an objective code of right and wrong, does not emanate from human opinion. It emanates from God and therefore transcends human opinion.
And we would agree with that 100%.
Absolutely.
That, and I appreciate that he does emphasize this, because he basically taught this in the introductory video. You know, the reason why morality can't be relative is because, at least it relates to 10 Commandments, it comes from God, it transcends men, and therefore there is an objective standard. So like we talked about before, he basically gives the moral argument for the existence of God, reason for God. But we would 100% agree with this. God's law does transcend human opinion and therefore is objective, especially since it's grounded and emanates from God's immutable, unchanging nature, right? So if it comes from God's unchanging nature and it's grounded in his very unchanging nature, it can't change. God is transcendent. His law is transcendent because it comes from God. Therefore, it is objective. It can't be changed based on human opinion or the whims of men. So we would agree with that 100%. We would just obviously take the different conclusion than he does about the law of God as a result, but we would agree with him on that.
The other meaning of ethical monotheism is that what God most wants from us is that we treat other human beings morally. None of the 10 commandments concern what humans must do, quote unquote, for God. Pre-10 commandments religions.
Now, this is where it really starts to get messy. When we're talking about the law of God, we have to be very careful that we don't read man's societal problems, man's societal situations back into the scriptures. And again, like I said already, Prager is coming at this from a really from just a societal point of view, right? He sees the law of God as primarily about or completely about how to shape society, how to treat our neighbors. And I think we can demonstrate this very clearly that this is not the case. The Reformed have historically broken the law of God up into two tables. You have the first table, which is about God, worship for God, love for God, and the second table, which is love for neighbor, how we treat our neighbor, right? They're two distinct modes of the law, but they're all related to one another. They're intertwined. You can't have one without the other, and vice versa. But they are distinct and they have their purposes. So when we're talking about the first table of the law, like I am the Lord your God, brought you out of the land of Egypt, and not making other gods before him, not taking his name in vain, and keeping the Sabbath day, that has nothing to do, at least primarily in and of itself, it has nothing to do with how we treat our neighbor. It's how we treat God first, because that's our first love. That is our first obligation, is love for God, right? And we can see this very clearly. I mean, you just move on a little bit into the passage, Exodus 20 verse 5. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. There's nothing in here about how I'm treating my neighbor as it relates to not worshiping idols, right? It's how I worship God. God is a jealous God, and therefore, because he's the creator, because he is the one who has the right to demand worship of his creatures, he can, in a right, just sense, be jealous. And so this has to do with how we treat God, and God will punish those who do not worship him only. We look at Leviticus 19, 1 through 4, and it says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. So you can even see there are commands in here that talk about loving neighbor, right? It says every one of you shall revere his mother and father, but it ultimately all ties back to worshiping and loving God, right? And the primary context here is about worshiping him, not making idols, because this is a violation of God's holiness. We should not do that. And that's the grounding. You jump over to Isaiah 44, 9 through 11. All who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Their witnesses neither see nor know, that they may be put to shame. Who fashions a god or casts an idol that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his companions shall be put to shame, and the craftsmen are only human. Let them all assemble, let them stand forth. They shall be terrified. They shall be put to shame together. Again, this is in direct relation to the commands to not create idols, right? Those who fashion idols are stupid. They're nothing. They're foolish because of what they're doing. And in context here, God has declared himself to be the creator, the sustainer of the universe, right? He's the first and the last. There's no other God besides him. So then it follows that to make idols is utterly stupid and foolish, because the creator of the universe has spoken and already made himself known in these ways and done these things. So idolatry has everything to do with our relation to God and not in relation to man. And then finally, we look at Leviticus 19:12. It says, "I will send." Oh, I'm sorry. 19. Zechariah 5:4 and then Leviticus 19:12. I will send it out, declares the Lord of hosts, and it shall enter the house of the thief and the house of him who swears falsely by my name, and it shall remain in his house and consume it, both timber and stones. So those who take the Lord's name in vain, those who who swear falsely by the Lord, they will be punished. Why? Because it's a violation of God's name. It's a sin against God directly. Leviticus 19:12, you shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Again, this is a sin against God. This is a commandment. The third commandment has to do with our relation to God. And what's interesting in verse 11 of Leviticus 19, Moses says that the people are not to deal falsely with their neighbor. So he addresses love for neighbor, but then shifts into talking about how they're to deal with oaths as it relates to swearing by the name of God. So he shifts from dealing with how they're to deal with their neighbors in verse 11 to verse 12, dealing with how they're to relate to God. So even in the old law, there is that distinction being made in Leviticus. So these are just things we have to be really cognizant of. And it's very interesting. None of my arguments were used from the New Testament. I used all of my arguments from the Old Testament, which you would think that Mr. Prager here, as a Jew, would be well versed in. But it seems that he is conveniently overlooked, or maybe he just doesn't know, but that would be a slight more on the knowledge that I think he should have as one who claims to hold the Old Testament in such esteem than the arguments he's presenting here. But anything you want to add to that, Sean?
Yeah, I do want to make a New Testament argument, although I'll ground its truth in the Old Testament. When someone comes and asks Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? He says, the greatest commandment is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then he says, and the second, meaning the second greatest commandment, the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So he's asked, what is the greatest commandment? So obviously, what is he going to do? He's going to go to the law of God. And in this case, he goes to Deuteronomy and says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So this being the first commandment, the greatest commandment, puts it above the you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's the second commandment. It's important, but it's not the first and greatest commandment. And I think you can see this actually just from the text in the Old Testament itself.
Mm-hmm.
The first or the commandment in Deuteronomy is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The commandment from Leviticus 19, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, loving your neighbor as yourself doesn't have the same force as you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So you can even hear it just comparing the two. Okay, one, I'm loving God with everything. The other, I'm loving my neighbor as I love myself, which is even a little bit more of a relative thing. It's just not as powerful, not as strong. So even just looking at those two texts, I think you can see that loving God is of a more importance. Not that you can break either commandment and be okay. You're supposed to keep both of them, but you can even see the little bit of priority given there. And that is what we see in the division of the law, right? The grouping of commandments that deal with God, commandments 1 through 4, all come first. And then the laws concerning the relationship between men come second. Why is that? Why that particular grouping? Why wouldn't they be interspersed? Or why wouldn't the one follow the, why wouldn't men come first and then God? I think it's showing the priority of, no, God comes first and then men. Again, that's not to say that you can therefore ignore all the ones that are dealing with men because they're second. Every single commandment of God is to be kept. But if we were to rank in importance, the commandments concerning God are in a sense more important.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think you can even pull this out of place like Romans 13, 8 through 10. owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. So you could even argue here that the commandments to love your neighbor come secondary, because really the love of neighbor is a fulfilling of the law. It's not the point of the law, as Prager would have us believe here. It's fulfilling the law. It's bringing to fruition what the law is about, at least in a sense. It's really fulfilling our love for God, right? So we're loving God, we're worshiping God, and then as we're doing these commandments, we're obeying the second table of the law, or the second greatest commandment. Then we are fulfilling what the law demands, which is to love God and to love neighbor. And like I said, those two things, loving God, loving neighbor, are intertwined. If you're loving your neighbor, you are loving God, but there is an order. We love God first, then that love for neighbor flows out of that love for God. If our worship of God is right, if we're obeying the first four commandments correctly, then we will inevitably love our neighbor as ourselves, therefore fulfilling the law. So I think that keeps that distinction that Jesus makes. You can see this in Mark 12, excuse me, where he's talking to the scribes and saying which is the most important, right? And he goes to Deuteronomy 6, right? Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So they're so closely related to one another, but there's still a distinction there that we can't miss, or we fall into this error that Prager's making. All right, continue on here.
All believe that people must do a lot for their gods. For example, feed them and even sacrifice people to them.
I think this is a really bad argument. Well, this is what the pagans did back in the day before the Israelites came along. They fed them, they gave to them. So that can't be what God is talking about here. That's a very weak argument. I think we've already demonstrated why through looking at these other passages. But just because pagans did this, they did things for their gods, does not mean that we are not obligated to do things for the one true and only God that exists, who demands righteousness and perfection from his creatures. So I think this is a very bad argument.
Yeah, it's honestly it's a little bit of a category error, right? Because we would agree that God doesn't need physical things to be done for him.
Right.
We don't need to feed God. We're
Right.
told that God doesn't dwell in a temple made with hands, as if he needed
needed
that. Yeah, he's God doesn't need things. He needs nothing. He doesn't even need us. So in a sense, yeah, we aren't able to do things for God, but we do things for God in the sense of, well, he's worthy of me doing this, so I will do it for him. So it's a little bit of a category error to say like, oh, well, none of the commandments deal with doing the things for God. Well, no, I don't take the Lord's name in vain for God, because his name is holy and is worthy to not be taken in vain. That's doing something for God, at least in a sense.
Yep, exactly.
But now, thanks to the 10 Commandments, mankind learned that what God wants is that we be good to our fellow human beings. Even the commandments concerning not having false gods and not carrying God's name in vain are ultimately about morality. The thing we can do for God.
As if morality is some kind of standard floating around out here outside of God's law.
Yeah, well, that implies that there's he says, I'll go back slightly just so I can quote exactly what he said.
Morality.
Yeah, so even the commandments concerning not having false gods and not carrying God's name in vain are ultimately about morality. And I agree, they are ultimately about morality, but that doesn't mean in distinction from them being for God. because to do
Right.
something for God is about morality.
Right. He's
like-
trying to separate those two things.
Yeah, which confused me a great deal because that seems to me just to be obvious, but he presents it as like, oh well, obviously it's about morality. It's not for God.
And then he's
very
the one who was saying that these 10 commandments come from God and therefore transcend human authority. So that would necessarily imply that these must be the standard of morality, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. If this was a consistent video, we wouldn't be here.
Do for God is to treat all his other children decently.
Pause.
Every
And that's in and of itself, that's fine as far as it goes, because we've already said that loving your neighbor is a form of loving God, but it still doesn't make that distinction necessary between the first and second table of the law.
Well, he said the thing you
Right,
can
the
do
thing.
for
Yep.
God, like the as if there was one thing you can do for God, and that's
Right.
love your neighbor. That's not correct at all. And I didn't look up the passage before this, so I'm quoting it off the top of my head. But there's a spot where in the law, if you given to the Israelites, if an Israelite comes upon even someone close, like a brother or a friend, and they have an idol that they've kept in secret, they're to bring it before the community and have that person stoned. And God says, "Your eye shall not pity him." Like you're not even to think about. You're not even to show any remorse. Like, oh, this is my friend. No, you're supposed to completely. He's going to die, and you're not supposed to pity him because he's done this wicked thing, right? Does that sound like, oh, I'm doing this for my fellow man as opposed to for God? No, you're supposed to have a relationship to God that's so ultimate that even your best friend, it doesn't matter if he's doing something evil when it comes to his relationship to God, he is to be put out of or is to be killed, and you're not even to pity him.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. The love for God was to transcend that love for neighbor.
Exactly.
Jesus did the same thing in those well-known passages about forsaking your mother, your father, your mother-in-law, blah, 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 denying those close relationships. You're to hate them, quote unquote, hate them in relation to me. Those loves are to seem like hate because you're to love me first, right? So there's that distinction again. There's that love for God that transcends human love that comes first and foremost before we love our neighbor. And that love for neighbor should flow out in the proper form as laid out in the law of God after we've put God first and made sure that we're worshiping him properly, we're honoring him properly. Because otherwise we're going to make an idol out of our friends or our neighbors. So Mr. Prager again has this very much backwards.
parent can relate to this. Parents, or at least healthy parents, have indescribable joy when they see their children act lovingly toward one another, and indescribable pain when they see their children hurt one another. So too God, who is likened to our Father in heaven, cares most about how we treat other human beings, all of whom are his children.
So this is a very bad false equivocation. God is just like earthly father, so therefore his intentions must be exactly the same as ours. That couldn't be further from the truth. God being the creator of the universe, which ironically he kind of puts off as unimportant. Well, the Ten Commandments, I think he's going to talk about this later. The Ten Commandments don't start with, "Oh, I'm the Lord your God who created the universe." But as the creator of the universe and the first cause of all things, he can demand what he wills from his children. He's commanded that we love him first, and he be worshipped above all things. And if anything else gets in the way of that, it is idolatry. So this is a earthly analogy that is pushed back onto God, and it's created this problem, I think, where we're seeing this love of neighbor being escalated above love for God first.
Yeah, I did want to at least mention, I found it interesting that he said something to the effect of God who is likened unto our Father in heaven. Where does that come from? That doesn't come from the Old Testament. That comes from the New Testament. And I know, from what I gather, Dennis Prager would have like a more of a Judeo-Christian view, not completely throwing out Christianity, necessarily recognizing it that's legitimate, at least for pragmatic reasons. But it's just interesting to me that he would use a New Testament teaching. But I would like to just
I think that comes from Jesus even.
yeah.
That's from the Lord's Prayer, I think.
It's from the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah. So and the Lord's Prayer is not quoting any Old Testament passage. That's Jesus giving instruction to his disciples.
Yeah. I'm not sure, like I'd have to do a search, but I'm not sure how often. I don't think there's any time in the Old Testament where God the Father is referred to as a father of humans. We would have a little bit of a dispute with the Jews in regards to, like, say Psalm 2, who's the son, because we would say it's Jesus. And I guess you could say that Jesus is human because he's both human and God. So.
And they might take Isaiah 53 or wherever it's talking about, we would see as referring to Jesus.
Yeah.
Where it's talking about he is the everlasting Father, Prince of
Peace.
Peace.
That's Isaiah 9, I think.
Oh, okay.
But yeah. So yeah, but I like, in terms of God being a father to your regular person, the Old Testament never says that, and it's because it's not true. The New Testament lets us know that God is actually not the father of all mankind. Two quotations here from John. This is from John chapter 1, verses 11 through 13, speaking about Jesus. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. So it's saying that those who believe in Jesus have the right to become sons of God, meaning they were not sons of God before. And then John 8, where Jesus is disputing with some of the Pharisees, you do the deeds of your father. Then they said to him, we're not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. Jesus said unto them, if God were your father, ye would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God. Neither came I of myself, but he sent me. So he's saying that they're not, God is not their father. And he'll later go on to say that you are of your father, the devil. So there's a confusion between creation of God and being a child of God. We understand that in the fall, the relationship between man and God was severed, so that we are no longer children of God, and that's something that has to be rectified. We have to become children of God. The only time that I'm aware that the scriptures refer to in any sense us being like in a generation relationship with God is Acts 17, where it uses the term offspring. We're the offspring of God. But there's a difference between being an offspring and being a child, or a son and a daughter. So the relationship has been broken, and I think it's wrong to say everybody is a child of God when that's not true. We're under the wrath of God until we are reconciled through his son, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I guess if you're talking in a strict creative sense, you could say we are his children. Like you said, we are his offspring. But yeah, if we're talking about a real child-father relationship as that intimacy that we see in the New Testament, that only comes through salvation. That's a spiritual change that must occur. And I don't know where Prager would fall on that, if children is creative or salvific. I think he's definitely more I know he's taught that if you're good enough, you'll get into heaven or wherever places. You don't have to be a Jew in order to be saved, quote unquote. Really, if the scales are tipped in your favor, you're good. You've done enough good works, you're fine. So yeah, it's their soteriology. His soteriology is very confusing. It's not doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
The third critical teaching of the first statement, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, is the importance and the meaning of freedom.
Oh boy.
Note that God is not saying in this introduction to the Ten Commandments that he created the world. It surely would have made a lot of sense for God to introduce the Ten Commandments with this statement, I am the Lord your God who created the world. That is, after all, pretty impressive and would make sense. I created the world, you better listen to me. But no. The one thing God declares is that he took the children of Israel out of slavery and into freedom. That's how much God hates slavery.
Oh boy. So this, God did not take them out of the land of Egypt to merely free them from slavery. In fact, it had nothing to do with freeing them from slavery because of slavery's sake. What's kind of interesting, Exodus 3 gives us exactly why he was bringing them out. If you look at Exodus 3:18, this is God speaking to Moses in the burning bush. He's given Moses his covenant name, I am that I am. He's instructing Moses on what to tell the Israelites when he goes to visit, to go and visit them. He says, and I think this is when he's speaking to the king of Egypt. So these are specific instructions for what to say to Pharaoh. It says, and they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Oh, wow, look at that. It's about worship. What do you know? So God is wanting to bring them out of the land of Egypt in order to worship him. God is looking for worshipers, right? He's looking for those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. He wants his people to worship him. And they can't do that properly while they are in Egypt as slaves and under bondage. So, sure, God certainly cared about their plight. He specifically told Moses that he's heard their cries and he's heard their wailings and he's heard their struggles. So he's not unsympathetic to that in a sense. But at the end of the day, this ultimately is about God bringing them out in order to worship him. And what's interesting is God continues to show his mighty works to the Israelites after they are brought out of the land of Egypt. And the Ten Commandments actually follow very shortly after they are brought out of the land of Egypt. It wasn't very long afterward that God brought Moses up to the mountain, gave him the tablets of stone, and brought them back to the people and instructed them how to live. Moses comes back from his month-long journey, and the Israelites are already falling into sin and doing debauchery and wickedness. It didn't take them very long to live like the pagans. So this is tied into Prager's understanding of the law as being a model for society. That's merely all it is. Oh, look, God brought them out. So he hates slavery. He's freeing them from slavery. And so therefore, God is setting the societal paradigm for us all to follow. And that's not what God was doing when bringing them out of the land of Egypt. It was to worship him. That was the goal. And certainly to help them as a secondary means, but the primary goal was to worship him, sacrifice to him, and call his people to himself.
Yeah, there's several problems I have with this. First, you're going to run into a lot of trouble when somebody's like, "Oh, God hates slavery," and then they start reading the rest of the law and realize that slavery is not abolished but merely regulated.
No.
Yeah, God does not hate slavery.
Neither is it in the New Testament either.
Yeah, neither is it in the New Testament either. Slavery was regulated as to not be oppressive. You see commands such as okay, well, if you beat your slave and cause permanent damage, it'll talk about like losing teeth or whatever.
Right.
That person is to go free. You've lost any right you had to that person's
Year
labor.
of Jubilee.
Yeah, the year of Jubilee, letting slaves go free. But God doesn't necessarily hate slavery in general, just
right.
Abuse of it. And really, what's going on here is slavery is meant to point to another slavery that we have that we need to be freed from, and that's slavery to sin, right? I see a little bit of a problem with how he's using this as an introduction, because people today weren't freed by God in the Exodus, right? If he's saying this is the preliminary statement to the 10 Commandments, I'm the Lord your God that freed you out of the land of Egypt, right? Well, people today weren't freed from the land of Egypt. How does it therefore apply to them if this is some sort of like, this is the reason why you're to keep the following 10 Commandments? But if we understand its spiritual significance, it's a little bit more relevant to people today. That's not to say that people that haven't been set free from the power of sin aren't obligated to keep the 10 Commandments. They still are. But the motivation for doing it is different when you have been set free. And then I just wanted to read a couple verses in regards to this. John 8:34, Jesus answered them, verily, verily, I say unto you, whoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. And the servant abideth not in the house forever, but the Son abideth forever. If the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. So some translations render these as a servant, other render them as slave, but it's talking about slavery and freedom, right? Because it says, if the Son shall set you free, you shall be free indeed. So there's something about sin that has power over us, that constrains us. And then Paul elaborates on this in Romans 6. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or obedience unto righteousness. But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered from you. Being then made free from sin, ye became the servants of righteousness. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as ye have yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity, unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. For when ye were servants of sin, ye were free from righteousness. What fruit had ye then in those things whereof ye are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. But now, being made free from sin and become servants to God, ye have your fruit unto holiness, and the end everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So there's a picture in the Old Testament of being freed from sin, and it's a picture. It's pointing to the fact that we need an ultimate freedom. We need an ultimate exodus out of the land of Egypt. Egypt is often associated with sin and wickedness. We need to be set free from the power that sin has over us. Otherwise, we will receive the wage of it, and that is death. But Jesus Christ has the power to save us from that wickedness, and we need to place our faith in Him to be saved. And that's completely lost when you look at it just from the literal sense. I'll say in regards to they were set free from the Egyptians.
Yeah. There's no typology going on in Prager's mind.
It's hard to have typology when you don't have the fulfillment. Because obviously we see typology all over the Old Testament because we have the fulfillment to compare it to, and like, oh, this pointed to this, oh, this pointed to this. But when you don't have that fulfillment, I mean, you still can get the typology, but it's a lot harder to do so.
Right. Yeah, he doesn't see, and that might be part of the reason why he goes the route he does and seeing this merely as societal, because he can't go anywhere else with it, right?
Yeah.
If he goes the spiritual route, well, it has to be either saving me or it's pointing forward to something that's not yet to come or that hasn't come yet. And he doesn't have that fulfillment. So.
And how important God considers freedom. The founders of America based their entire view of America on this belief that God wants us to be free.
No. We see very clearly in Scripture that there is a concept of slavery, even as it relates to Christians, right? Going back to Romans 6, like you talked about, Sean, Paul says we're either slaves of sin or slaves of righteousness, right? The concept of slave, we're bound to our master, whether it be the devil in sin or whether it be bound to Christ, and living for him. But this he's imposing an enlightenment concept of freedom back into theology, which we would reject. The freedom is not obligated of anybody. We are blessed in this country to have freedom, and we're not complaining because we have freedom, but it isn't necessary. There's no human right as it relates to having freedom in the sense that he's talking about. Spiritually speaking, we are slaves of Christ. We are slaves of those whom we serve. And we, as slaves of Christ, are willingly following our master. It's not a burdensome slavery, but there is no freedom obligated to anybody whatsoever, either physically or spiritually. Yeah. So this, again, it's reading Enlightenment, paganism back into Christianity or Judaism, and it's definitely creating problems as it relates to exegesis.
Yeah. Yeah. Humanity will be slaves to something. Like for the person that wants to say, "Oh, well, I'm free from everything." Well, what that means is you are a servant of sin. You just don't realize it. So you will be slave to something. And why would you want to be slave to the master that's cruel and will lead to your death, as opposed to the slave to the all good God? Yeah, the founding fathers, comment from Desiree, the founding fathers also weren't opposed to slavery. Yeah. And he says that the founding fathers were they all believe that God was for freedom or opposed to slavery or something. A lot of them were deists and believed that God wasn't involved in the affairs of humanity at all. So on multiple historical grounds, it's a false statement.
They wouldn't agree with you anyways, probably.
Yeah. And then it's not the same God. It's a deist God. So why are we even appealing to them?
Yeah.
That is why the most iconic symbol of the American Revolution, the Liberty Bell, has only one sentence inscribed on it, a verse from the Hebrew Bible: proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof.
Liberty from what?
You know what that's from, Sean?
I should have looked it up. I'll be honest, I didn't look it up. But looking at the New Testament fulfillment of what I suspect that is, like the liberty that's being proclaimed there is a liberty from sin. It's not a liberty from some sort of material slavery.
One other equally important lesson about freedom imparted by the opening statement of the Ten Commandments: what freedom means. The giver of the Ten Commandments is in effect saying, I took you out of slavery and into freedom. And these 10 commandments are the way to make a free society.
No. That's like, oftentimes there are things that are implicit in a statement, but there's normally some additional context to let you know that this is something implicit that you want to draw out here. Nowhere in it is it necessarily implied that, oh, this is for a free society. And you read the rest of the Old Testament and how the law is applied, and the New Testament, and it's just not how that the law is applied. It's never applied like, oh, this is to make a free society.
Like, no, and you know, unless you're some some Christians who claim that this would be the model of a free society, theonomists.
Well, I don't even, because they would go to the civil laws. I don't even think a theonomist would say the 10 Commandments alone are a model for a free
no, not alone
society.
It would definitely be part of it.
Definitely. But
if you're making this the model for a free society by itself, I mean, you're going to have all kinds of problems, but even you're going to have problems on the civil side too. Because then, you have issues of fulfillment, difference of covenants, what has been abrogated based on the fulfillment of the covenant. So I mean, there's all kinds of covenantal issues that you get in when you pull back the onion even more, that you get into. But this can't be a model of for free society in of itself. I mean, it's not going to solve all of those societal problems. If it did, why were there civil laws imposed on top of the 10 Commandments, anyways, for the Jews who were given this law directly, right? And that's why we make that distinction between positive law and moral law. You had the moral law, which grounded and was the foundation of all of these other positive laws. And then you had the positive laws that were in addition to the moral law, which got into the nitty gritty of society itself. Clearly, even in their time, the 10 Commandments weren't enough to run that society. God instituted positive laws to help do that. So it's very problematic.
Yeah. And again, I'd like to point out, like, if he's talking about physical slavery,
Right.
the law prescribed physical slavery, not an abusive form of slavery,
yes,
but slavery
but it didn't
nonetheless.
forbid it.
Yeah. So I don't know.
People, if you do whatever you want. Freedom comes from moral self-control. There is no other way to achieve it.
Pause.
And fourth and finally,
freedom comes from moral self-control. In a sense, I agree with you. But we are born slaves to sin and do not have that moral self-control. And merely knowledge of the law doesn't give us the ability to keep that law, to exercise the self-control that we actually need. Just knowing the law. Many people know what the law is and they break it all the time. It's not knowing what it is. We need to be set free. We need to be born again. We need to have a new spirit put in us, one that loves God and therefore wants to keep his law.
He's assuming way too much about the human condition. And what's funny, when I did research on him, he did say that men are, if I remember correctly, that men are not basically good. So I don't know why he would think that this would be a consistent statement at all with his own view of the human condition.
I have to imagine men are not good, so therefore we need a law. It's like, well, like you've missed something there, because men will just not keep the law. It doesn't matter.
Just do the evil that they want to do in the first place.
You need a heart change, so that they want to keep that law.
Right.
And that's just giving the law. We cannot do that. It's not possible. And that's why we want Leviticus. Christie again says Leviticus 25:10. Is that the scripture he's referring to? I don't know. Do you know what Leviticus 25? What was it? 25:10.
25:10. Yeah, we didn't look it up, and we should have.
Leviticus 25:10. Oh, it might be actually. I need to go to a different website though, because it's not what I want. Oh, okay. So that is referring to the Jubilee. Okay.
So you could, in terms of slavery, I guess you could apply that. But it doesn't do away with the fact that slavery was still there and regulated under the old covenant. Well, it's just that every, at the year of Jubilee, those slaves were released and things like that.
Yeah. Two things on that. That's another type that's pointing to a Jubilee, a freedom that we have in the new covenant.
Yep.
So while there is actually a physical aspect there, or a material, or I guess you'd say a physical aspect there, that doesn't negate the fact that it's pointing to something. The second thing being, well, if God is anti-slavery, this verse is a problem, because it's saying on the Jubilee year, the captives can go through free.
Right. Well, not that slavery as a principle is abrogated.
Yeah. So every Jubilee year, fine, they can go free. But what about all the non-Jubilee years?
Right. What about the other 7 years?
Yeah. By telling us that he liberated the Hebrew slaves, God made clear that he cares deeply about human beings. It is impressive to create the world, But what most matters is not only that there is a creator, but that the creator cares about his creation.
Yeah, creating the world, that's nothing. But loving people, that's really what the big issue is here, Sean.
Yeah.
You never mind I created it out of nothing, but that's not a big deal.
I mean, in other spots in the Bible, God grounds the reason why we should obey Him in His creatorship. I don't have one off the
He's
top
the
of my head,
creator, so
but
worship me.
yeah. So it's like, okay, in this one spot, He's referring to His salvation as the reason that you should obey Him. It's like, well, I agree. Because of salvation, we as Christians should obey Him. I agree with that, but that's not the exclusive reason why He is to be obeyed.
Right.
And Dennis Prager sort of treating it like, well, this is the reason, because God cares about humans and hates slavery. That's the reason why we should obey Him.
Yeah.
And it's not accurate. It's not accurate from a Christian perspective, and it's not accurate from the Hebrew Bible as well.
Yep.
All of that is in the one statement with which the Ten Commandments begins. I'm Dennis Prager.
So yeah, we're already off to a great start on the 10 Commandments here from Dennis Prager. We haven't even gotten to the actual commandments yet. So Lord willing, next week we'll start diving into the first commandment.
I think next week, aren't we having Andrew on?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, next week we're going to be doing a Christology episode, talking about the immutability of God as it relates to the incarnation. So Andrew's going to be on next week. That's correct. And then, Lord willing, the week after that, we'll pick up where we left off. We'll see how that goes. We're trying to set up some guest appearances. We have one guest lined up for towards the end of September. We'll announce that as we come to that point. But just some closing marks. Again, we're found on the Society of Reformed Podcasters. You can check us and other podcasts out at reformedpodcast.com. Check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. If you're watching on YouTube and you like what you heard and haven't yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button and click the bell so you can be notified when we put out new videos. But with that, everyone have a great weekend and Lord's Day, and we'll see everyone next week.
God bless.